Good morning. This is my decision in the applications in respect of Mr. Peyton. Because of the unusual arrangements for taking the evidence of Mr. Peyton, it was not possible precisely to follow the normal Rule 9 procedure, and accordingly I take a more flexible approach to the oral applications. Mr. Anwar raised a large number of points. It seems to me that many of the points raised by him are perfectly legitimate points which could appropriately be advanced in submissions. I have already indicated that after the hearing on cause of death, I shall invite written and oral submissions on the evidence heard up to that stage. So, for example, it would be open at that stage to make a submission that the evidence of Mr. Peyton that Sheku Bayo had embarked on a course of conduct with a view to killing Mr. Said was speculation on his part and unsupported in evidence. Another example of a matter which could be the subject of submission would be that Sheku Bayo did not, in the event, take advantage of Mr. Peyton's incapacity and attack him. While that is a legitimate point to make in submission, I do not consider that further evidence from this witness in relation to that or the earlier example would assist the inquiry. In respect of a number of other matters canvassed by Mr. Anwar, I consider that they have been canvassed to the extent that they can be with this witness, and that further exploration would not assist the inquiry. In relation to the long-standing feud within the Peyton family, I consider that a detailed examination of that would be collateral and would distract the inquiry from its task. I have, however, on further consideration, come to the view that specific allegations of racist statements are relevant to the terms of reference. Mr. Peyton has already been asked about such an allegation made by his grandfather. I consider that he should also be asked about the specific allegations of racist remarks by him advanced by his sister Karen and her husband Barry Swan. I shall therefore invite counsel to the inquiry to pursue these specific issues with Mr. Peyton. I shall also allow questioning in respect of two further specific issues. First, I think that when Mr. Anwar ascribed evidence to Kayleigh Good, he was in fact referring to the evidence of Ashley Wise in relation to what she said she heard Sheku Bayo say during the restraint, and I shall allow that to be explored with Mr. Peyton. I shall also allow questioning of Mr. Peyton as to whether he or Craig Walker stated at the police office that they had killed a man. I think that, in addition to the points raised by Mr. Anwar, that also covers the first issue raised by Mr. Moyer. In relation to Mr. Moyer's submission on training, I am not satisfied that further exploration of this with Mr. Peyton would assist the inquiry. In summary, therefore, I shall constitute a further closed hearing at which counsel to the inquiry will examine Mr. Peyton on the issues which I have identified. Thereafter, the recording will be played in public in due course. Now, Ms. Graham, who is the first witness today?
The first witness will be Christopher Fenton, and he is present.
Very well. Do we have the witness, please? Good morning, Mr. Fenton.
Good morning.
You're going to be asked questions by Ms. Graham. Before that, would you say the words of the affirmation after me? I solemnly, sincerely, and truly
I solemnly, sincerely, and truly
declare and affirm
declare and affirm
that I will tell the truth,
that I will tell the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
and nothing but the truth.
That's great.
Thank you. Good morning.
Morning.
You are Christopher Fenton.
Yes,
And what age are you?
I am 34.
You're a community psychiatric nurse, as
Yep.
I understand it. You have a bachelor's degree in psychiatric and mental health nursing.
Yep,
You've worked in that area or that field since 2013.
yep,
And from September 2014, you were working in the Ravenscraig ward at Whitemansbury Hospital in Kirkcaldy.
yeah,
We've heard that that's a psychiatric hospital.
yep.
It has, as I understand it, around 65 patients in the.
I think it's just one ward now of about, I think it's about 25 patients it has.
So it's maybe smaller. In
Yeah,
2015, were there more patients?
No, there's still just one ward, maybe about 30.
Right, 30. Could you very briefly just tell us about the type of work you were doing in Whitemansbury Hospital?
Yeah, so it covered a variety of mental health illness for people aged under 65 and over 18. So it was an acute admissions ward.
And what does it mean, an acute admissions ward?
So that's more if people are having an acute onset of mental illness, they'll be admitted to wards when they're not able to be maintained in the community.
You're here today because I'm going to be asking you some questions about the 3rd of May 2015.
Yep.
And I want to make sure you've got everything you might need in front of you. So you'll see a black folder
Yep.
in front of you. And when I refer to a paragraph in a statement, it'll come up on the screen in front of
Okay.
you. But that'll just be one paragraph or maybe two.
Yep.
But you will have hard copies of your statements in front of you. And please, if you want to refer to any other sections,
Okay.
please do that. Let me know what they are and we can put that on the screen.
Okay, that's fine.
Can we look first of all at a statement dated the 17th of June 2015? Now that should be in your folder and we'll also see that on the screen. And there we see it's a statement with your name, Christopher Fenton, psychiatric nurse, taken the 17th of June 2015.
Yep.
And it was taken by trainee investigator Stuart Taylor and investigator Ross Stewart at your home address.
Yeah.
And can we also look, please, at paragraph 20 of your inquiry statement, which is SBPI 11, while they're bringing that up on the screen. Am I right in thinking that when you gave the statement to PERC that you were doing your best to try and tell a true and accurate account of what
Yeah.
happened on the 3rd of May 2015? And if we look at paragraph 20 of your inquiry statement, which I'll come to in a moment, it does say, I believe my memory of the incident was clearer at the time of giving a statement to PERC than it is now just with the passing of time. I gave a statement to the Crown around a year after the incident, and I remember that statement was a lot shorter than the one I gave to PERC. I suspect that was because I couldn't remember the same level of detail. The statement I gave to PERC was given to the best of my memory at the time, and I did my best to be truthful and accurate in what I said. I expect that the PERC statement will be more accurate than what I recall now. If there's any discrepancy between what I have said in this statement and my statement to the PERC statement should be preferred. I remember reading over my PERC statement at the time. And is that correct?
Yeah, that's correct.
Thank you. And then can we look at the first page of this inquiry statement? And we'll see that this is a statement you've given to the inquiry, and it was taken by a member of the inquiry team on the 10th of December last year.
Yep.
And if we look to the paragraph 23, so the end of this statement, it says, I believe the facts stated in this witness statement are true. I understand that this statement may form part of the evidence before the inquiry and be published on the inquiry's website. And in the light of that, you have then signed it.
Yep.
Now, you'll see that your signature has been redacted from the copy on the screen, but the one in your folder should have your
Yeah.
signature on it. And it was signed on every page on the 31st of March this year.
Yep.
Thank you. Now, in addition, you should also have a copy of a spreadsheet, a combined audio and video timeline, might be on the left, big A3 page. And you'll see that this, I don't know if you've seen any other evidence, Mr. Fenton. No. Well, this is a spreadsheet that we've been referring to with other witnesses.
Okay.
And you'll see on the left-hand side, there's times in the 24-hour clock listed. And so this is a combined audio and visual timeline. To the left of centre is something called the event airwave transcription. So it's notes of airwave transcriptions of calls between the police.
Yep.
And just to the right, there's a description of visible events in the video. And what I'll be doing at one point is going through some combined footage of CCTV and other things. And we'll be able to use this spreadsheet. But when we come back to it, I'll explain the area I need you to look at. Let's start with your inquiry statement and look at paragraph 4, please. And we see here you've told the inquiry, you remember it was a Sunday morning about 7:20 in 2015.
Yep.
And you were driving in your car, which was a black Honda Civic.
Yep.
And you were travelling from your house to Whiteman's Hospital. And
Yep.
you've already told us that's where you were working
Yep.
at the time. And the route you took is you came up Henry Road, travelling north towards Hayfield Road. You remember a police car passing you on Henry Road at quite a speed. I can't remember if it was 1 or 2, but I definitely remember a police car passing me on Henry Road because it was heading towards my work direction. And usually police are involved if there's a psychiatric emergency. So that was the first thing I noticed.
Yep.
It was a Vauxhall Corsa, silver or white. It had lights on and possibly sirens. I continued on Henry Road, and then as I approached the mini roundabout near the White Heather pub, we've also heard that's sometimes called Gallagher's pub.
Yeah. Yep.
I seen a lot of police cars and vans in the proximity. I thought it was probably a patient that's from off the ward. At this mini roundabout, there's a right turn into Hayfield Road. The police cars and van were just scattered along a distance of about 100 yards on Hayfield Road. The nearest vehicle to me was on the right-hand side of the road. As you look down the road towards the hospital, it was possibly the Corsa that passed me shortly before on Henry Road. I looked dumped on the road. Is that maybe
Yes.
It looked dumped on the road, not parked parallel to the curb, and then you marked a map. So just looking at that paragraph for a moment, you said that you thought it was probably, or you wondered if it was a patient from off the ward.
Yep.
What made you think that?
We have quite a high instance of patients absconding from the ward that we contact the police and report them as missing.
So as soon as you notice that a patient has absconded, you contact the police?
Yep. Depending on the severity of their illness when they abscond, if there's any risk, we'll contact the police.
And when you say risk, what do you mean?
For example, somebody might be absconding to end their life or cause harm to others.
Right. So if you're concerned about them self-harming or harming others, your first port of call is to phone the police?
Yeah.
How often do you require, or did in 2015, did you require to phone the police in relation to patients?
It would vary, but potentially several times a day.
Oh,
We'd contact the police, yeah.
right. So this was a common occurrence?
Yeah, we went a locked ward, so it was patients could easily abscond.
Right. And did you have regular contact with the police in your job in 2015?
Yep. Throughout my whole time at Ravenscraig Ward, yeah.
And how long were you there?
4 years.
And when we talk about contact with the police, would you have to meet with the police or speak to the police on a regular basis?
Yeah. Yep. So if we reported somebody missing, the police would come and collect a statement.
Right. And would the police often help to find the person who'd absconded and bring them back to the ward?
Yeah.
Did they always bring the person back to the ward?
Yeah, 9 out of 10 times. Unless if it was somebody that was repeatedly absconding, they'd maybe take them to a different hospital. Assist with that.
Any bad experiences where the person had followed through with the risk that you were? Yes.
Yep.
Can I ask you to look now at some footage for me, please? This is an evidence video timeline, and this is where we'll look at the combined audio-video timeline, which is the spreadsheet I referred you to a moment ago. And I'm going to ask, it's already prepared, I'm going to ask that a small segment of the footage is shown. Let me explain to you what you'll see on the screen first of all. So the top left-hand corner is a grey box that says real time. And that's, we've heard that that's to within 1 second accuracy of the actual time on the day. So the time on the screen at the moment is 7:22 and 23 seconds, and it's on the 3rd of May 2015. And you'll see that there are buttons underneath, 101 calls, 999 calls, and airwave transmissions.
Yep.
So there's also audio here. And sometimes we'll hear an airwave transmission, which is a call between police officers that they can hear. And you'll hear that, and that button will light up.
Okay.
Underneath that, it says emergency status. You can ignore that for the moment. And at the bottom of the screen is CCTV footage that we've heard comes from Gallagher's pub, or the White Heather pub, from a camera that was fixed on a building there. And you'll see the roundabout that we see on the left-hand side. And the road that goes off in the distance is Hayfield Road, we've heard. And the road closest, travelling along the bottom of the screen, is Henry Road. Do you recognise that area?
Yep.
And then at the top, in the middle, there's a tile called reconstruction. And that shows a bird's eye view of Hayfield Road with the roundabout at Henry Road.
Yep.
And you'll see that there are already some cars in that area with the white blocks. So we've heard evidence that when a vehicle arrives, that was reconstructed in the image at the top. But for the purposes of this footage playing at the moment, I'd quite like you just to look at the CCTV.
Yeah.
And also, let me take you to the spreadsheet, please. So you'll see that the time I'm going to look at is 7:22 and 23. So if you look at the bottom of page 5, you'll see 7:22.
Yep.
Now we're just slightly the moment I'm interested in it is actually on page 6, and that will be at 7:22 and 40 seconds. So you'll see a small clip beforehand, but I'm interested in 7:22:40, where a dark coloured vehicle enters the scene going north on South Henry Road towards the roundabout and turns right into Hayfield Road. I'm going to be asking you some questions about that once we've played it. So we'll just watch that now.
Control.
Sorry, carry on, please.
Control from 411.
Thank you. And if we could go back to 7:22 and 40 seconds, please. If we could just play that for a couple of minutes and just carry on, please, playing it for a second or two. Stop, please. Do you see that car
Yep.
The dark coloured car that's come into the view from the right-hand side. Do you recognise that car?
Yeah, looks like my car.
Your car. And that car, if we just carry on playing, actually, we'll see that it turns right on Hayfield Road. And is that the journey that you were taking effectively to
Yes.
work that day? And if we just pause that there. By the time you were in Hayfield Road at that time, do you remember how many police cars there were?
No. I think my statement was 5 or 6.
Could we also look at paragraph, well actually we'll look at some images first of all. If we could look at still images 2, image 4. Now this image is a 3D reconstruction, an image of the scene in 2015. You'll see that actually there's only 4 cars there.
Yeah.
But is it correct that you came in from the left here and
Yes.
then travelled along Hayfield Road, avoiding the vehicles? And heading towards Whiteman's Brae, which would be off to the right?
Yep. No, off to the left.
Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
So
the
you
Vic's
would,
on the right.
Sorry.
Whiteman's Brae is on the
So
left.
you would drive along Hayfield Road, travelling,
Yeah.
as we look at this screen, to
Yeah.
the right-hand
Yeah.
side. But Whiteman's Brae Hospital was
It's on the
further up
left-hand
that
side,
road,
yeah.
to the left. Thank you. Sorry, I tried to confuse you there.
I confused
Um,
myself.
Right. Can we have a look at your inquiry statement now, please? And we'll begin with paragraph 5. And if we look at the beginning of it, it says, I turned right into Hayfield Road. As I was driving past the police car I have described, I could see a bunch of police officers on top of somebody on the pavement towards the right-hand side of the road. I had a clear view of this through my driver's side window. I wasn't far along Hayfield Road, maybe a house or two. It was like a pile of bodies on top of somebody. I remember seeing Sheku's shoulders and his head, and then a bunch of police officers on top of him. It looked a bit like a rugby scrum. It looked like the police officers were all lying on him, like it was evidently right in the middle of some sort of restraint. I don't know exactly how many police officers I saw that were part of this, probably 6 or more. I have marked the number 2 on the attached map showing their location. And then if we look at paragraph 6, please. I saw this as I was driving past, so I was watching this scene only for a couple of seconds. I could see Sheku was lying prone on his front. I could tell this from the position of his head and shoulders. I could also see a bald head at the top of his head. I could see the man had dark skin. I couldn't really see his face, although his face was slightly to the side. His head was towards the curb and his feet were towards the houses, so his body was lying across the pavement. I could just see the tops of his shoulders. He must have been wearing a grey or whitish T-shirt. And then paragraph 7. I couldn't see any movement from Sheku or the officers. Being involved in restraints in my line of work, sometimes people fall and you end up on top of them. I just assumed that was what happened when I drove past. With the experience I have in restraint, there wasn't anything that stood out to me or caused concern other than the amount of people that were on top of him. But I had no context on the lead up to that point. At that point that I drove past, it was just a pile of people on top of him. So I assumed that they've just taken him to the ground and they've not started kind of managing him as yet. I suppose it's all in context. If they're lying there for a split second, there's less risk. If they're lying on top of him for half an hour, there's much more risk. I presumed I was only seeing the initial seconds of this gentleman being restrained. I'd like to go over all those 3 paragraphs with you, if that's okay.
Yeah, of course.
You've got all of them on your
Yep.
hard copy. We'll go back to number 6, please. So you've described a bunch of police officers lying on top of somebody. That's paragraph 5, sorry. And if we just stay on page we see paragraph 5, the second line. I could see a bunch of police officers on top of somebody on the pavement. You had a clear view out your driver's window. And then you mention later the number of officers. So when you say on top of somebody, can you give us more of a description of that?
I think the best description I could give, it was like a rugby scrum. It was just a bunch of people piled on top of somebody.
We've heard other evidence from a witness who described it as a collapsed rugby
Yeah.
scrum. Would you agree with
Yeah.
that description?
Yeah.
So, not a rugby scrum where the players are
No.
upright,
Just like a bunch of bodies piled on top.
piled on top. Thank you. And you've said that it looked like they were lying on him.
Yeah.
Now, it may have been suggested that for the layperson, it may look like people are lying on someone, but that it's actually a technique that doesn't involve lying on someone. You obviously, with your experience as a psychiatric nurse, are you confident in your description that they were lying on someone?
Yeah.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, there's multiple bodies on top of it.
And just to be very precise, did you see the weight of people on top of the person on the ground? Did they have their body weight on that person?
Yeah, that's what it looked like to me.
Did it appear to you that force was being used by the officers to restrain the person to the ground?
In the time that I drove past, I didn't see much movement at all. And that's why I assumed I had possibly fell on top of him.
Right. If we look at PERC 251, which is your statement from the 17th of June 2015, and we look at page 3 and paragraph 1, you talk about, actually if we start at the bottom of the previous page, you say that when you turned right into the roundabout, at Hayfield Road, you saw the dark-skinned male with the T-shirt. He was lying in a prone position. I'm not sure if he was facing down into the ground or if his head was maybe turned slightly. He was lying across the footpath, and then you say that I maybe saw as many as 6 officers. I can't remember if it was a mixture of male and female officers or how many of each. I do not think I'd be able to identify any of them. I only really glanced out of the window, although probably an extended glance. I was still driving and had the various scattered police vehicles to manoeuvre past. I was probably more focused on the male than the police officers. None of these officers were standing. They were all on top of the male. It really just looked like a pile-up. I can't really recall exact positions of individual officers. I couldn't really make out individual actions or movements of anyone involved. There didn't appear to be a lot of struggling going on. I would have said that the officers had gained control of this male. I assumed that he was probably a pretty big guy to have required so many officers to restrain him. I don't know how long this male had been in this position for. So certainly in your original statement, you've said you didn't see a lot of struggling, although you were focusing on the male on the ground. So when you say struggling, do you mean the male on the ground wasn't doing a lot of struggling?
Yeah, or the officers.
Or the officers at that time? Yeah. Thank you. Let's go back to paragraph 6 for a moment of your inquiry statement, please. You said in paragraph 6 that he was prone, so he was on his front.
Yep.
Can you describe the position, as far as you remember, where he was? And if you wish, we could go back to the image of image 4 of still images 2, and you could maybe use this to orientate where the person was. So you'll see this is a sort of bird's eye view of Hayfield Road, if you like. You maybe don't know, but if you touch the screen, you can actually apply a red circle.
Okay.
So if you can show us roughly the area where you saw the pile-up.
Right here.
Right. let's just remove the second one. Now also, if you want to move that circle, you can put your finger in the middle and move it around, and it will adjust. And if you prefer, Miss Drury can remove it.
Okay.
Are you happy with that
Yeah.
area? And could you tell us where the man's head was when you drove past?
Yep. So his head was towards the curb, and his feet would have been towards the hedges,
Right.
so lying
Now,
across the pavement.
We may have heard that his head was closer to the hedge
Okay.
and his feet were closer to the pavement. Do you have any comment about that?
That might have been before or after I drove past. But I'd definitely seen his head because I was trying to identify if it was one of the patients from the ward.
Right. Thank you. I mean, you didn't know who it was in the end. And you said in your inquiry statement that his face was slightly to the side.
Yep.
What direction was his face facing?
As far as I could recollect, it would have been towards Whiteman's Brae. So he would have been facing to his right.
To his right?
Yeah.
And to the right of this picture as we look at it?
Yeah, so facing towards the cars in the picture.
Right. And his feet, where were his feet at that point?
They would have been towards the hedges.
Towards the hedges. And then can we go back to paragraph 7, please, of your inquiry statement? And you say you couldn't see any movement from Sheko or the officers. Sometimes people fall and you end up on top of them.
Yep.
And you just assumed that's what had happened at the point you drove past.
Yes.
And you said, I assumed that they've just taken him to the ground and they've not started kind of managing him as yet. I suppose it's all in context. Can you explain to the chair what you mean by that? They've not started managing him yet.
So in my line of work, if people fall and they end up in a prone or face down restraint, we try to get them onto their back or into a seated position
Why do you do that?
so that we don't compromise their breathing.
Why would it compromise their breathing?
The weight, pressure on their lungs could restrict them being able to take breaths.
Right. And when you say you try to get them on their back, how quickly do you try to get them on their back?
Almost instantly.
And when you say almost instantly, can you help the chair understand what that means?
Yeah, so for example, if we've got somebody that's face down in a prone restraint, we might utilise that position to administer medication. Once that's done, we'll transition a patient onto their back.
So how long would it take normally or generally to administer medication?
Seconds.
Seconds. So that's your training as part of the... Obviously the police don't have medication
of course.
with them, but in your line of work that's the aim that you would have. Is that the way you're taught to get the person up almost immediately?
Yeah, we're not even trained to take people to the ground in terms of prone restraint because it's so dangerous.
Was that the position in 2015 or is that the
Yeah.
position? Yes. So you would try and avoid that if possible?
Yep. Obviously, we appreciate that when people fall, sometimes they'll fall face first.
Mm.
They end up in that position naturally.
Are you, in your experience of restraint and the training you've had, you've talked about trying to avoid them being on their front.
Yep.
What about applying weight to the back of the person while they're on their front? Do you have any experience or training of that?
We never do that.
Why do you say that?
Again, it compromises their ability to breathe.
Do you know in what way it compromises someone's ability to breathe?
It affects their ability to inhale a breath.
Right. Can I ask you to look at the spreadsheet again, please? Now, in paragraph 7, you say at the end there, you assumed they'd just taken him to the ground. If they're lying there for a split second, there's less risk. If they're lying on top of him for half an hour, there's much more risk. I presumed I was only seeing the initial seconds of this gentleman being restrained.
Yep.
I'd like to explore that sort of with you, because obviously at one end of the scale there's a split second,
Yep.
and at the other there's half an hour.
Yeah.
And I'd like to...
That could be much narrowed much down.
I'd like to try and narrow that down with you, because
Yep.
you've expressed that view. Could I ask you to look at... Let's look at 721.19. So this should be on page 5, I think. Page 4, sorry. Oh no, page 5. 721.19, page 4. And you'll see on the spreadsheet at the time 721.19.
Yep.
No, we don't need the footage. I'm just going to look at the spreadsheet to give you some context in terms of timing.
Yep.
PC Ashley Tomlinson's emergency status is turned on. Do you see that at that time? It's towards the last 2/3 of the way down the page. In the column that's slightly to the right of centre, there's a red box. PC Ashley Tomlinson's emergency status is turned on. Page 4. Oh.
Yes.
Right, and you'll see the time there is 721.19.
Yep.
We've heard that by the time that emergency status is turned on, Mr. Biles on the ground. So that's the sort of starting point I'd like you to think about, 721.19. And then if we turn on to the page 6, 722.40 to 51, or 722.50, the dark coloured vehicles enter the scene. You've told us that was your car.
Yep.
And then let's look at that time just for the moment. That's a period of 91 seconds.
Yep.
So let's think not about a split second, but let's think about 91 seconds.
Yep.
Do you have any views? You obviously, in paragraph 7 of your inquiry statement, you talked about the two extreme
Yeah,
ends of the
yeah.
timing scale. What about 91 seconds? Any views about that?
So is that him being restrained for 91 seconds on the ground, or?
He's on the ground being
Okay.
restrained by police officers. Now, we've heard evidence that different officers arrived at different times.
Yeah.
So I don't want to give you the impression that there were 6 officers on him at any one time for
Yeah.
that length of time. But being restrained, we've heard evidence from PC Tomlinson that he was being restrained at the time his emergency button was
Okay.
pressed. So that's the 7:21 and 19 seconds. And then your car passes at 7:22.50.
Mhm.
So we're talking about 91 seconds.
Yep. I suppose it depends how long they've taken to control him during that restraint as well. I think 91 seconds is a long time for 6 people to be lying on somebody, but I have no recollection of what's happened prior to that.
No, you
Has there been
don't.
a struggle? Have they been on top of him for that period of time?
All right.
Has there been an opportunity to move him positions?
You've expressed concern in your paragraph in your inquiry statement about the duration
Yep.
of a restraint. Is there anything that causes you concern in relation to that period?
Of 91 seconds?
Yeah.
Yeah, if there's 6 people lying on top of him, yeah, I'd be concerned.
And then looking at page 7 of the spreadsheet at 7:25:17, we've heard evidence that is 7:25:17, so that's almost halfway down the page.
Yep.
You'll see it in the second column. A PC Smith said the male certainly appears to be unconscious, breathing, not responsive, get an ambulance for him.
Yep.
So we've also heard evidence that he was being restrained by officers up until they noticed that he was unconscious, but breathing. That's a period of over 4 minutes on the ground being restrained. So again, can you help the chair in any way? You've obviously expressed comments in your inquiry statement about the duration.
Yep.
Do you want to express any comment about a period of 4 minutes?
Yeah, I think 4 minutes is quite a long time given potential for excited delirium and managing that. And like you said, police don't have medication to manage these, so I suppose they've got to manage with what they've got in the tools that they utilise.
Thank you. I'll come back to what you've just mentioned later, because we're going to look at another paragraph in your statement about that. Can I ask you one thing about Perk 251 before we move on? Again, on paragraph, page 3, paragraph 2. So this is page 3, paragraph 2. You say, as I passed through the scene, I saw a male uniformed police officer standing on the footpath on the south side of Hayfield Road. He was stood next to the passenger side of the transit-style police van and was facing the incident. Probably 6 foot or more, average build, and maybe in his 40s. He was white, had no obvious facial hair, and had a police hat on. He didn't have glasses on. His demeanour seemed quite relaxed. I wonder if we could go back to image 4 and still images 2. Can you show us where this officer was standing when you passed? Again, if you touch the screen and...
I can't remember, sorry.
Oh, you don't remember?
Sorry.
All right, that's fine, thank you. Can we go back to your inquiry statement, please, paragraph 8? You say, I was trying to get a look at Sheku as I was driving past because I thought if it's one of my patients, I probably could hop out, be of assistance. So that's where my focus was at the time. So your focus was very much on him. But he was prone, but you could see that it wasn't a patient.
Yep.
And then paragraph 9, you say, as part of my job, I've had training in restraint. We used to go on 2-day courses called Safe and Therapeutic Interventions. So it was a control and restraint course. As part of that, we received training in de-escalation. We'll always try and verbally de-escalate at the start. You would try and verbally de-escalate around whatever the stressor was that was triggering our patients to escalate, regardless of the situation. But sometimes it's inevitable that we'll have to physically restrain people. By verbally de-escalate, I mean talk through the person's behaviour and try to problem solve, work out the reasons for the behaviour and see what resolutions you could come to. A big one in psychiatry is patients escalating because they've run out of cigarettes. So in terms of coming to solutions, maybe having a nurse escort them down to the shop to buy cigarettes, etc. Can I ask you about this paragraph?
Yep.
Could you help the chair understand what you mean when you say you try and verbally de-escalate at the start around whatever the stressor was that was triggering our patients to escalate?
Yep.
Can you tell us what that is?
So I suppose any changes in people's behaviour, we would instantly have a conversation with them and try and find out what their stressor was at that time that was causing whatever the change in the presentation was.
When you talk about having a conversation, does that have any technical meaning, or is it simply speaking to the person?
Yeah, it's opening up a line of communication for them to express their needs, their wants at that time.
And can you tell us about the tone that you would use to try and de-escalate a situation?
I would try and be as friendly as possible.
Would you use a similar tone to the one that you're using now?
Yeah. Yep.
Yeah. Would you shout at the person? Or shout commands at the person?
Depends on the situation. If they were walking out of the hospital, potentially on a busy road in traffic, yeah, I would shout.
But in terms of trying to de-escalate
Yeah.
What is the tone you would use?
Yeah, there would be no point in me escalating my behaviours to de-escalate somebody. It's trying to keep everyone as calm as possible.
And what about the sort of body language that you would adopt?
Yeah, an open body language, open hands.
Would you give the person some space?
Yeah, I would make sure I was a couple of metres away from them.
What about, why would you be a couple of metres away from them?
It would give me some time if they decided that they were going to attack me. It would give me some time to get out of that situation.
So it would allow you to preserve your route of escape?
Yep.
What about time? Would you put time limits on the amount of efforts you made to de-escalate?
No.
Why do you say no?
Just our practice is always to use the least restrictive intervention, and that would be the least restrictive for us. I would much rather talk to somebody for an entire shift if it meant I didn't have to restrain them.
So if you're adopting the least restrictive or the minimum level of restriction,
Yep.
Communicating with, with words and with your body
Yep.
language would be the best method to do that.
Yep.
And you'd do that as long as a full shift, if you had to.
Yeah, if I had to, yeah.
What would happen for you if the patient was completely non-responsive? So they didn't say anything to you. Would that cause you to increase your level of engagement with the patient, or would you continue to attempt to de-escalate?
I suppose, again, it depends on the scenario. If someone's not wanting to talk to me, I'll maybe leave them be, go back in 5-10 minutes, try reinitiate that conversation. If they're not communicating and their behaviours are escalating, I suppose you then don't know what the risk is to yourself or others, so that might involve restraint or medication, or just medication being offered orally first.
So when you say leave them be, could that involve just stepping back and leaving them in their own space for a while?
Yeah, if, for example, if they were on the ward and they were in a side room, I'd leave them be in the side room, then go back in 5 minutes, but kind of keep an eye on the room so that you know where they are.
I was going to ask you, would you continue to observe
Yeah,
them?
yeah, we'd continue to observe.
Yeah. And why would you continue to observe?
Because they may be at risk of self-harming.
Okay. And would that then allow you to take
Intervene.
action
Yeah.
if required?
Yeah.
And can we look at paragraph 16, please? And do we see, in terms of employing de-escalation techniques, I would use this much more than restraints, and using these techniques on a daily basis. I think we're quite good at de-escalating situations before it gets to a restraint when we're dealing with distressed individuals on a regular basis. I find de-escalation techniques very effective, but again, it's circumstantial to the individual as well and the rapport you've got with them.
Yep.
And if we could just go back up to the top. You're saying that you use these de-escalation techniques that you've been taught or did on a daily basis.
Yep.
Right throughout a shift, are you
Yeah,
trying
of
to
course.
de-escalate situations?
A lot of patients will be detained, so they're there against their will, and so your entire shift may be appeasing that.
So many of your patients may not be very happy about
Yep.
the situation they're in.
Yeah, of course.
Are many of your patients, or can they be aggressive
Yep.
and violent?
Mhm.
But you still say that you think you're quite good at de-escalating situations before it gets to a restraint.
Yep.
So
I think we've also got medication that we could utilise in between times. That helps.
how often do you have to restrain a patient? Or in 2015, how often did you?
It would vary. Sometimes you could go a week or two with no restraints. Sometimes you'll go weeks on end restraining every shift. It just depends the clients that you've got in at that time.
All right. And then can we look down at the next, the end of that? You say, I find de-escalation techniques very effective. tell us about your experience and the successes that you've had with de-escalation.
I suppose it comes down to reciprocity. And when we're taking away patients' liberties and their freedoms, we're using verbal de-escalation to give back and improve their mental health and their wellness. So yeah, I think it is effective in these scenarios.
Okay, thank you.
The cigarette one's quite a good example. If somebody's detained in hospital with no time out and they've run out of cigarettes, that could be something that will escalate somebody pretty quickly.
Mm-hmm.
And yeah, that is quite a common win in terms of nursing staff being able to verbally de-escalate people and come to that compromise, whether we escort them down to the shop or we go for them in our own time. But I would much rather spend my break nipping away to the shop to get somebody cigarettes than leading to restraint as they're trying to leave the building.
Yeah, thank you. Can we look at paragraph 10, please? And you've touched on this already. You talk about the restraint training also involves training on how to carry out a risk assessment when considering if a patient needs to be restrained. We are constantly risk assessing patients. There are risks involved in any restraint, from minor risks, bumps and bruises, to extreme risks such as death. Of all the risks, the risk of compromising a patient's breathing is the key thing. Restraining a person in a face-down position is risky. I am aware that a person's oxygen saturation levels drop simply by being in the face-down position. Lying on a person in the face-down position increases the risk of compromising a person's breathing due to the pressure that is being put on their chest. If a person was face-down, you would want to move them out of the position as soon as you can. So before we move on there, just lying face-down on the ground, for example,
Yep.
reduces your oxygen levels.
Yep.
Weight applied on top further reduces those levels.
Yep.
And the longer that weight is applied to the top, the riskier it becomes.
Yep.
Thank you. And then you say moving them onto their back is better, but ideally you want to get them into a seated position.
Mm-hmm.
So why is it you want to get them into a seated position?
Just in terms of comfort and dignity, being able to maintain their airways as well, there's nothing that's going to compromise that. I suppose if you're lying on your back and somebody starts to struggle, somebody might lean across you by accident or fall on top of you, which again is going to put more weight, pressure on your chest, compromising your breathing.
So even if you were on your back, that could, if someone was lying over you, that could also cause a reduction. And then you say, previously we were trained to take a person to the floor when undertaking restraint. Now we're trained to avoid that where possible.
Yep.
So can I ask you about 2015? What was the position then?
I think it had shifted by then. Initially when I'd done that training in 2013, we were trained to take people to the ground, but I think by 2015 that had changed. It was the part of that training then became floor management. If someone is to fall onto the floor, how we manage them then.
So in terms
somewhere
of,
between 2013 and 2015 I think it changed.
So in terms of your work in the psychiatric field,
Yep.
that had already changed, that guidance and training?
Yeah, as far as I'm aware.
Yeah, thank you. And you then talk about risk assessment. And if we could go up the page, please. So you are carrying out risk assessments. Is that daily?
Yeah.
Or in 2015 it was
Yep.
daily? Yeah. Depending on the patient and the situation that you were faced with?
Yep.
And then paragraph 11, please. This is a paragraph where you deal with ABD, acute behavioural disorder or
Disturbance. Yeah.
We deal with a lot of drug-induced psychosis. Verbal de-escalation skills might not be as effective if the person you're dealing with has a drug-induced psychosis. However, I would still attempt via verbal de-escalation, as we always go with the least restrictive option. So again, that's what you've said a moment ago.
Yep.
You would always try
Yeah.
de-escalation.
Yep.
I would still attempt verbal de-escalation, as we always go with the least restrictive option. It's traumatising to be restrained, and there are physical risks involved that I've already mentioned, so we try and minimise that, especially with people who are already disturbed mentally.
Yep.
And when you talk about people being disturbed mentally, are you including in that drug-induced psychosis or ABD?
Yep.
And I understand that you mentioned earlier excited delirium, and
Yep.
you've mentioned here ABD. My understanding is that the understanding of those conditions, if you like,
Yep.
has evolved over recent
Yeah.
times. Is that your understanding
Yes.
as well?
Yep.
We'll maybe hear more about that in due course. Can we look briefly at paragraph 17, please? And you've said, I work with patients with ABD or psychosis fairly frequently and possibly daily, even now in the community. So is it quite a common occurrence, even in the community?
Yeah. Yep.
The use of de-escalation and restraint with those types of patients, I find that the success of de-escalation comes down to your rapport with the patient.
Mhm.
If you do have that good relationship, you've got a much higher chance of being able to successfully de-escalate something if you've built that trust with them. For patients who I didn't have that rapport with, or I hadn't had the opportunity to build a rapport, say, because they were newly admitted to the ward, I still find that de-escalation techniques can be successful in that situation, but sometimes they're not. It's hit or miss. Sometimes you might have a situation where verbal de-escalation is not working. You end up in a restraint, then you're in the same situation the next day, and verbal de-escalation works.
Yep.
You'd always try it though.
Yeah. Yeah. Yep.
And this is something that you've obviously built your techniques in de-escalation over years of
Yeah.
working in
Yep.
the psychiatric field.
Mhm.
And then paragraph 17, I think you say you're rarely involved in restraint now
Yeah.
in your current role.
Yep.
Is that because you've moved from an acute ward to
Yeah,
a
'cause I'm in the
community
community now.
situation?
Yep. We still provide assistance to the wards
Right.
if required. If they pull their emergency alarms, if we're in the building, we'll respond to it.
Oh,
So we still can be involved, but it's much rarer now.
okay, thank you. Paragraph 12. When attempting to restrain a person, I would always involve others. We would never initiate it on our own. In terms of maximum numbers of persons involved in a restraint, I'm not aware of being advised of any maximum numbers of people during restraint. However, the more people you add in, the messier it could get in terms of communication, of who's doing what and who's coordinating a restraint. What do you mean it can get messier in terms of communication?
I think if you've got too many people involved, it's harder to communicate who you want to delegate to do what part of the restraint. I suppose that's more common in unplanned restraints. When I worked in IPCU, at the start of the shift, everyone would be designated what they were doing in terms of restraint.
What's IPU?
Intensive Psychiatric Care Unit. So, for example, at the start of the shift, you might know who will be administering medication, who will be managing their head, who will be taking arms, legs, etc.
Right. So you would allocate roles for someone to look after the head?
Yep.
What would they do at the head?
So they would be the ones that are communicating with the patient, keeping an eye on their breathing. If the patient's trying to bang their head on the floor, they would manage that as well.
When you say communicate with the patient, what does that involve?
Yeah, just talking to them. Trying to, again, even during restraint, still trying to verbally de-escalate.
Right. So even as the restraint may be going on, there's someone allocated to the head to continue speaking to the
Yeah.
patient.
If there's nobody allocated to the head, for example, if I was restraining somebody and I had an arm, I would still be talking to the patient, trying to come to a resolution.
Can that work,
Yeah.
even at that stage?
Yeah, sometimes we could talk to patients and get them to take oral medication rather than being injected with medication.
All right. And you talk about breathing, someone checking breathing.
Yep.
What do you mean by that?
So they'll be counting their breaths per minute to make sure that that's at an appropriate level. Also, we would put a pulse oximeter on somebody's finger, which would count your oxygen saturation. So the person on the head would usually keep an eye on that as well.
What's an appropriate level of breaths per minute?
It's been a while now. Between 11 and 18, I think it is.
And someone's actually counting those?
If the person's taking excessive amounts of breath, the person on the head might try and talk them through their breathing as well to calm them down. And
so that can also be ongoing as
Yep.
part of the communication?
yeah, yep.
Can we look at paragraph, at the end of that paragraph you say 5 people would be a maximum in a nursing situation. Is that with a planned restraint?
Yeah.
Yeah. Can we look at paragraph 13, please? During restraint, we'd usually have a nurse managing the person's breathing, or if somebody involved in the restraint was at the person's head, to stop them banging their head.
Mhm.
And they'd be talking to the patient and monitoring their breathing. We would try and get some equipment on them as well, check their oxygen stats during restraints. And if they're prone, we'll try and get them on their back as quickly as possible. So again, do we see there's a priority given to getting the person off their front?
Yeah.
Paragraph 14, you talk about whether it's a planned restraint or not. If it's not a planned restraint, do all these arrangements and delegated roles go out the window?
Yeah, sometimes. If it's unplanned, for example, if you had somebody that was planned at the start of the shift to take arms during a restraint, they might be on the break, so it's...
Okay. What remains the priority, even if it's an unplanned restraint?
Patient and staff safety is always a priority.
And what about if the person's prone, what remains the priority?
Do you mean, for example, if we can't get them out of that prone position?
No, I didn't actually, but we can look at that. Would the priority remain that you should get them out of that position as soon as possible?
Yeah. Yep.
What if you can't get them out of that position?
Increase our awareness of their breathing and try and ensure their safety, make sure there's nothing obstructing their breathing, nobody's leaning on their backs, etc.
So make sure no
And-
one's leaning on their back.
Yeah, and listen to the patient, whatever they have to say during that situation. They might tell you that they can't breathe.
Okay. So someone at the head checking, communicating,
Yep.
checking the breathing and speaking to the patient. And again, continuing to try and de-escalate
Yep.
even at that stage.
Mhm.
Can I ask you about loss of consciousness? You mentioned this at the end of this paragraph, paragraph 14. If there are any concerns regarding loss of consciousness, you will see that person checking their breath and pulse. How would you go about checking the person's pulse?
Either their wrist or their neck, or we'll use equipment as well.
And how do you check someone's breathing?
You'll be looking for physical signs of them breathing, either listening to see if you could hear them breathing, watching their chest for rising and falling.
If the person appears to lose consciousness, what would you do?
Start CPR.
Straight away?
Yep.
You wouldn't wait?
No.
You wouldn't wait for that person to stop breathing, would you?
Well, if I'd observed that I'd stopped breathing, we'd be starting CPR.
So if they've lost consciousness but they are breathing, would
yeah,
you...
sorry, we'd get them in a recovery position.
What else would you do?
We'd be contacting doctors and putting out for cardiac arrest team and stuff to come.
Right,
It's a medical emergency.
thank you. And then can we look briefly at paragraph 20? You mentioned speaking to the Crown Office around a year after the incident. I understand that to be the 11th of October 2016.
Yes. Yep.
And you say that you weren't able to give the detail then that you were able to give in your PERC statement.
Yeah, I don't think the questioning was as detailed either.
Right. What do you mean by that?
I'm sure my statement to PERC was about 3 sides A4, and I think it took several hours to do my statement with PERC. With the Crown, I think I was in and out in about half an hour.
Right. And speaking to a fiscal?
Yeah.
The copy I have appears to be 2 pages, or 2, and then you may have a copy of that in your folder, I don't know. Just a few lines at the top of the 3rd page. You maybe don't have that.
I don't think so.
All right. Thank you very much. Could you give me a moment, please? That concludes my questions for this witness. Thank
Are
you.
there any Rule 9 applications? And Ms. Conway.
Yes,
Mr. Fenton, I wonder if you would withdraw to the witness room while I hear some legal submissions. Now, Ms. Connolly, perhaps you could come first to the table. Yes.
So we have a couple of questions for this witness. The first relates to restraint and the response by the individual being restrained. And I would wish to ask this witness how they would interpret a restrained person grunting. And in terms of de-escalation, I would wish to ask this witness, in their view, when they're verbally seeking to de-escalate a situation, would they shout at an individual, "Get down on the fucking ground"? And again, in relation to de-escalation, this witness said that he would approach a patient with open hands. And I would like to ask this witness how he would interpret open hands if a patient was using same to him.
These
That's
your
all.
questions? Yes. Perhaps
That's
if you could
all.
return
Thank
to your
you.
seat and I'll hear from Mr. Can you come to the table now, Mr. Yes.
Thank you, sir. We have a couple of matters arising from our original Rule 9 application on behalf of Constables Gibson and McDonough and Sergeant Maxwell, and some additional matters that arise from the evidence that has been led today. In relation to those matters that arose in our original Rule 9 application, one of the areas that we wish to discuss is in relation, firstly, to Senior Counsel for the Inquiry's questions regarding the context about this witness's experience and training within which he carries out restraints, in contrast to the restraint that's being engaged with by these police officers. So looking at that, question 1 of our application and the questions of prior rapport, etc. The second matter is that covered in question 6, which is given in his training restraint, he notes that nothing he saw or looked excessive or of concern, to cover that with the witness. And then finally, in relation to the written Rule 9 request, whether it was possible, given the limited period of view and restricted angle of Mr. Fenton's view, that officers were not all on top of Mr. Bayou, and that some may have been trying to control his legs and apply restraints to his knees or feet. And in that regard, reference would be made to the video and audio footage played to him earlier. In terms of the additional matters, sir, firstly, and in conjunction with the last point, it was put that there was a concern whether Mr. Fenton would be concerned about 91 seconds of restraint up to that point, but also his suggestion that he would be concerned if 6 people were lying on Mr. Bayou. But of course, it's whether to invite and put to him whether or not what his view may be, where there were less officers involved in the restraint up to that point. And finally, in relation to the question of being restrained for 4 minutes, the cry has heard evidence that during that 4 minutes there was a period of ongoing struggle, active resistance, and then different numbers of officers involved in the restraint, and then those officers doing different things, many not putting weight on Mr. Bayou. So putting those positions to him, given his evidence today, sir. Those are the issues we wish to cover.
Thank you. I'll rise briefly to consider these submissions. I shall allow Ms Connolly to ask the questions that she wishes to ask. In relation to the issues raised by Mr Adam, I shall allow you to ask the questions relating to the first and second matters arising from the written submissions. In relation to the additional matters, it seems to me that it is a matter for the inquiry to assess his evidence in respect of time periods in the light of the whole evidence before the inquiry, and I do not consider that it would assist me to explore these issues with this witness further, so I shall not allow you to ask these additional matters. Now, if we can have the witness back, please. Mr Fenton, you're going to be asked questions by Ms Connolly, who's counsel for the families of Sheikh Obayo. Ms Connolly.
Thank you, sir. Mr Fenton, if in the course of restraining a patient, that patient began grunting, how would you interpret that?
I would assume that they're experiencing an excited delirium if they're grunting.
And I'd like to ask you about de-escalation.
Yep.
You've given us a bit of information about how you would seek to verbally de-escalate a situation. Would you consider it appropriate to shout at a patient, "Get down on the fucking ground," as a method of verbal de-escalation?
No, I wouldn't shout at a patient, no.
And again, in relation to de-escalation, you've told us that you would approach a patient with open hands.
Yep.
How would you interpret if a patient approached you with open hands?
I would assume that they're not going to attack me. Whereas if they approach me with clenched fists, and I think they're showing as well, they've no weapons. And so,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, my lord.
Now, Mr Adam, will you come forward, please? Mr Adam will ask you some questions. He represents certain police officers.
Okay.
Mr Adam.
Good morning, Mr. Fenton. Good morning. You've been asked certain questions today about your training and experience in the context of restraining patients.
Yep.
Now, I just want to ask you some questions about that initially. So, if I can understand that training, that's in the context of medical facilities.
Yep.
So that would either be a hospital, or is that perhaps clinics which you're working now?
Yep.
And
all other kind of hospital areas as well would be covered, car parks, etc.
And in terms of thinking of the hospital environment you were in 2015, many of the patients would have suffered from significant mental health issues.
Yep.
And on their arrival as patients to the hospital, would a risk assessment be carried out in relation to them and their
Yep.
risk to staff?
Yep.
So if I can put it this way, unless a patient is being restrained on arrival, you as a nurse in the hospital would have familiarity with the risk that any given patient presents at any given time.
Yeah, I suppose even if they arrived being restrained from a different facility, the risk assessment would be handed over from the nursing staff that are bringing them.
And in terms of your restraints, are they typically being performed within the sort of the environment of a hospital?
Yeah.
Which has, is an enclosed environment, even if it's not secure.
Yep.
And with those patients, do you often have a prior relationship or rapport?
Not all the time. I suppose we have to build that rapport with every one of our patients, and you start from your baseline the first time you meet them. So sometimes with restrained people we'll have no rapport with.
But sometimes you often do
Yeah.
have a rapport.
Yep.
And in terms of engaging with them and thinking about the sort of restraint techniques that you have, do you have available to you, for example, handcuffs,
No.
leg restraints,
No.
or other things that we might think in terms of police officers have, like CS spray or batons?
No.
And you're not trained to restrain members of the public?
No.
And
But then I suppose, what's the difference between a member of the public and a patient? They're still members of the public.
But you're not trained to restrain members of the public walking around the street?
No.
And just finally on this issue, have you ever been trained as a police officer?
No.
Turning then to your statement, I think you gave to Procurator Fiscal, and if you bear with me one moment, the reference for that is COPFS 00048. It's a relatively short statement. In that, I think if you just turn to the last paragraph, you note there that against my background of training in restraint, I did not see anything which caused me concern, but I only saw it for about 30 seconds. So,
Yep.
Is that an accurate reflection of what you saw that day?
I don't think I saw it for 30 seconds.
But in the time that you said you didn't see it for about 30 seconds, would you accept that it might be less than that?
Yeah. I was probably 10 seconds into driving past.
And you noticed you were driving past. Is that because you've also got cars on the road in
Yep.
front of you? So in terms of that brief period that you saw it, you didn't see anything that caused you concern?
Other than the number of bodies that were on top of Mr. Bio.
Thank you. I have no further questions.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Fenton, for coming and giving evidence to the inquiry. You're now free to go.
That's great, thanks.
Do you wish me to adjourn briefly for bringing in the next witness?
Yes.
Oh, we might have the break, actually. Yes, okay, we'll have the break at this stage, so 20 minutes. Now, Miss Graham, who's the next witness?
The next witness is David Taylor, who will be taken by Malerna Jr.
Good morning, Mr. Taylor. Would you take the oath? If you raise your hand. I swear by Almighty God
I swear by Almighty God
that I will tell the truth,
that I will tell the truth,
the whole truth,
the whole truth,
and nothing but the truth.
nothing but the truth.
Miss Thompson.
What is your full name, please?
David Taylor,
How old are you, Mr. Taylor?
55.
And you are a paramedic with the Scottish Ambulance Service.
That's correct.
How long have you held that role?
About 20 years now.
Before I ask you any questions, can I invite you to take a look at the folder in front of you? I want to make sure that you've got everything that you need to give your evidence today. And the first thing you should find in there is a statement that you gave to a member of the inquiry team. That's SBPI 17. Anything I refer to will pop up on the screen, but it might be helpful to you to have hard copies in front of you as well. So here we see a copy of your inquiry statement. It was taken on the 23rd of December of last year. And if we scroll down to page 13, please. If we scroll to the very bottom, please, thank you, we'll see that you signed the statement on the 31st of March of this year. Your signature has been blanked out on the publicly available copy, but your signature should be on the hard copy in front of you. And if we scroll up just a little to paragraph 71, we'll see that your statement concludes with the words, I believe the facts stated in this witness statement are true. I understand that this statement may form part of the evidence before the inquiry and to be published on the inquiry's website. And having said that, you went on to sign the statement. If we can also look at paragraph 70 briefly. You have explained in your statement that you spoke to someone at the PERC and later someone, I think, at the Crown Office. And you say that your memory would be better then than it is now, and those statements should be preferred if there's a contradiction within this statement. You've been shown a handwritten copy of your PERC statement and can confirm it's your signature at the bottom of each page. Okay. So the statements, and we'll look at them shortly, would have been taken much closer in time to the statement that you gave to the inquiry, which was at the end of last year. Let's turn to your other statements then, and again, these should be in the folder in front of you. PERC 179. Again, this will come up on the screen, but should hopefully also be in hard copy, Mr. Taylor. We see this was a statement that you gave on the 19th of May of 2015 to a Ross Stewart at the ambulance depot very early in the morning, it seems at 10 to 7 in the morning. When you spoke with Mr. Stewart from the PERC, did you tell the truth?
Yes.
And do your best to give a complete and accurate account of events?
Yes.
And for completeness, we should also have your statement, or your precognition rather, that you gave to the Crown, at COPFS 51. And it was taken about 18 months later on the 25th of October of 2016. Mm-hmm. Again, did you tell the truth when you spoke with the Fiscal?
Yes.
And do your best to give a complete and accurate account of events.
Yeah.
You should also have within the black folder the patient report form relating to this case. That's got reference 1068. I don't think we need it on the screen just now, Ms. Drury, thank you. But if you can satisfy yourself that it's there in hard copy in the folder between you. And finally, you should have an A3 spreadsheet. I think it's sitting underneath the folder.
Yeah.
And we'll come to that in due course, and I'll explain its significance when we look at it together. So I'd like to ask you questions about a call that you attended on the 3rd of May of 2015. And I understand that your shift on that date started at 7 o'clock in the morning.
That's correct. Yeah.
And that you were partnered with Alan Finlayson.
Yes.
And that you were both at the ambulance station in Glenrothes when you received a call.
That's correct.
The call you received was at 7:24 a.m.
Yeah.
The incident that you were asked to go to was in Kirkcaldy. Would Glenrothes have been the nearest ambulance depot to Kirkcaldy?
There is an ambulance station in Kirkcaldy, but the fact that we got the job, I would assume that the ambulance was just on another call in Kirkcaldy, so we would be first resource or closer to that job.
So you would have been the nearest available resource
Yes.
for the job. You explain in your inquiry statement that it was your role on this day to complete the patient report form,
Yes.
which we mentioned a moment ago. If you could have a look at it, please, and we might bring it up on the screen now. Please, Ms. Drury, it's PERC 1068. And I would just like to ask you to confirm that this is the patient report form that you completed.
It is, yes.
We see at the very top of the form that it's dated the 3rd of May 2015 and it's timed 08:37.
That's correct.
Can you help me to understand whether you completed this form in real time or retrospectively or perhaps a bit of both?
No, it's completed in real time, but that time is when the patient's been taken to the hospital. We've left the patient in the hospital, and then I'll go to the ambulance to then finish off the PRF. And then once that PRF is closed, that's the time it will be actually closed on the tablet.
Okay, PRF, is that patient report form?
Yes.
All right. So it's completed in real time, but the timestamp of 8:37 would be the point in time when you effectively closed down this particular job, I
That's
think you
correct.
called it earlier. So that concluded your involvement in the case.
Yes.
But the entries that we see and we'll go on to look at were completed in real time.
It was completed at the hospital after we dropped the patient off at the hospital.
We'll be going through it in some detail, and I'll ask you to help me to understand when certain pieces of information were received
Right.
by you. But before we do that, I'd like to ask for your help in making sense of some of the entries. Are some of the times that we see recorded there, such as call received, call passed, crew mobile and so on, are they generated automatically by your system?
They are, yes. When I looked at that, when I got the patient report form, I think what's happened there is when you go mobile, you have first an acknowledge button and then you hit mobile. I think what's probably happened there is that we've probably hit the acknowledge button and then we looked at the text of the messages and we haven't actually hit the mobile button. And then when we've arrived at scene at 7:33, it then just backfills the times in. But when I've actually filled the patient report form in, I've actually taken all the messages and the times off the screen and put them into the report form. So that, although that looks wrong, the times in the actual report are correct.
I see. When we scroll down shortly to look at the report, we can look at the times. But I was keen to understand whether that was some sort of glitch. I don't think there's any doubt at all that you received the call at 7:24 and arrived at the scene at 7:33.
Yeah.
And I wondered whether it was a technical glitch or perhaps possibly because 2 ambulances had been called to the locus in relation to 2 patients there, and it may be suggested that in fact your ambulance was initially intended to attend to an officer,
Right.
but when a person being restrained by the police became unresponsive, you then being the nearest available resource were effectively diverted because that became the priority call. Does that ring true, or was that simply not
No.
within your knowledge?
No, we were going for a police officer injured. That was our call.
Yes.
And then when we arrived at scene, we then were dealing with the patient in cardiac arrest. And as far as I was aware, at that particular point, we were the only ambulance attending that scene at that time.
All right. Well, let's look firstly at the next page, please, where some of the history that you've just shared with us is in fact recorded. If we could scroll to the bottom, please, Ms. Drury, there's a paragraph on the left-hand side, history of episode. And this is the paragraph, I think, that contains the accurate timings that you
Yes,
referred
that's
to
correct.
earlier. So I wonder
Yes.
if we can begin by going through this together. Crew at Glenrothes Ambulance Station received call 7:24 to outside Victoria Road, Kirkcaldy, for male police officer assaulted head and facial injuries.
Injury, yep.
All right. So the call that you received was at 7:24. You were asked to go to Victoria Road
That's
in
correct,
Kirkcaldy, and you were made to understand that the patient was a male police officer who
That's-
had been assaulted
Yeah.
and had head and facial injuries.
That's correct.
Now, where did that information come from?
That comes onto the screen on the vehicle. When you go into the vehicle with the job up on the screen, there's a text message and that's where that information comes from. And that's sent by control
Right.
to
So,
the
this,
vehicle.
so the source of the information is the control.
Yes.
Would that be the area control room at Bilston?
No, the control room's in South Queensferry for the ambulance.
I see.
Yeah.
We've heard some evidence about the workings of the area control room in Bilston so far as the police are concerned.
Right.
But should we understand then that the control room from the ambulance perspective is a separate
Yes,
entity
it's a separate entity, yes.
and it's based in
South Queensferry.
South Queensferry? Can we assume that there's some line of communication between Bilston and South Queensferry?
Yes, the police and ambulance service, they'll have a direct contact with each other.
So if, for example, the police officers who were at this incident had sent airwave transmissions to their control room requesting an ambulance and providing some information,
Yes.
should we understand that information would then be conveyed from Bilston to South Queensferry?
Yes, that's what
Who
would
would
happen.
then dispatch the nearest available resource and provide the crew with information on a screen in the way that you've
Yeah,
explained.
that's correct, yeah.
Returning to the form and the history, undate, I wonder if that should perhaps be update
Update, sorry,
message.
yeah.
Update message 725. Police advised assailant had a knife unknown,
Yeah,
where assailant is. Police are in attendance.
in attendance, yeah.
So should we understand then that by 7 or at 7:25 you received an update from your control room to that effect,
That's
that
correct.
the assailant had a knife and his or her whereabouts were unknown?
That's right.
Did that information flash on your screen, or
Yeah,
do
it comes
you?
up another text message on the screen.
All right. So you're not using a radio to communicate with your control room.
Not at that particular stage, no.
En route address changed to Seafield Road.
Yeah.
So at some point en route to Kirkcaldy, you were told it wasn't Victoria Road, it was
The Seafield Road.
Seafield Road. CC code 04. Can you help me with
It
that?
just means the code 04 is a code that allocate to the job, and that just means it's assault. It's just a...
And was that new information, or did that fit with your understanding of the
I
incident?
think
you
that
were going
just
to?
comes on the message, the text message that comes on the screen. Yeah.
Advised by control of new address on Hayfield Road, Kirkcaldy. Then message 730, PT, would that be patient?
Patient, yeah.
In middle of Hayfield Road. So sometime prior to 7:30, you were advised that the locus was in fact Hayfield Road, not Seafield Road or Victoria Road. And the patient was in the middle of Hayfield Road. Again, did that flash across your screen?
I think it was the way I worded that, advised by control, I think that was a radio message at that point.
We've heard evidence from the officers who attended this incident that they all carry radios,
Yeah.
and they can transmit and receive messages using the police airwaves. And we've heard some evidence too that other emergency services use the same airwave
Yes, you use
system.
airwaves, yeah.
So you have the same kit,
Yes.
essentially, a radio that allows you to transmit messages to your control room
That's
and
correct.
to receive messages from them,
That's correct.
as well as the screen that you have in the ambulance. Update message 731, junction of Henry Road and Hayfield Road.
Yeah.
So you've received another update, and then we see told by control that patient in cardiac arrest.
Yeah.
Might that have been an airwave if you've recorded?
I think just the way I've written it again, told by control, I think that's an actual airwave message, yeah.
Arrived at scene 7:30 at 3.
Yeah.
So this is all information that you received prior to your arrival at the scene, and all of this information came from your control room.
That's correct.
Now, although both the police and paramedics use airwaves, should we understand that you're using different systems? You're not listening to one another's
No, they're totally separate
messages?
from each other. Yeah.
Totally
Yeah.
separate, okay. So would it be the case then that the officers on the ground, as it were, would relay information to their control room, and insofar as that information was relevant for your purposes, Bilston would convey the information to South Queensferry, and they in turn would relay the information
Yeah, that's correct.
to you? Is it sometimes the case that the control rooms, either or both, have to interpret and make sense of messages that they are receiving?
Yes, it's just depends on the quality of information that gets passed back and forward. Yeah.
And does it ever transpire that information passed to you is incorrect or incomplete?
It can do, yes. Yeah.
I think perhaps an example of that might be the change to the locus that
Yes,
you were
the
asked
addresses
to,
that change.
that we were asked to attend. So let's look at that. Can we look at your inquiry statement, please? At paragraph 9, you explained the first message was to go to Victoria Road for a male police officer, head and facial injuries. At paragraph 11, you explained that you made yourselves mobile. So this was a standing start from the ambulance depot,
That's
is
correct,
that right?
yes.
You weren't already out and about?
No, we're in the ambulance station at the time.
Okay. And you were updated and advised of a new address of Seafield Road, Kirkcaldy, for an assault. You explain at paragraph 12 that each of the updates were very quick and didn't cause any delays to get to the incident because you were on the Thornton bypass, the A92, when you received them. And then at paragraph 13, you explained that when you received the proper address at 730 Hayfield Road, you were approaching the Gallatown roundabout in Kirkcaldy. You were already going towards the correct address.
No.
So I don't know Glenrothes Kirkcaldy terribly well, but from your statement, should we understand that from the moment that you were in the ambulance, you were effectively heading towards Hayfield Road and being provided with incorrect information about Victoria Road and Seafield Road didn't actually cause you any additional time?
No, I mean, when you go from Glenrothes, you're heading to Kirkcaldy, and as you approach Kirkcaldy, if by that time we've got Hayfield Road, so we're able to take the right turn in at the roundabout and head towards Hayfield Road. If it had been that extra few minutes, we'd probably been heading down towards Seafield in the wrong direction. So.
In the event, no harm done.
No harm done, yeah.
I'd like to show you a little bit of footage of the ambulance arriving at the scene, just so that we can confirm the arrival time and that it was, in fact, your ambulance. Before we do that, let's look at the spreadsheet. I said that we would come back to this. And you may be aware, Mr. Taylor, I don't know whether you've had the opportunity to watch any of the evidence that's been led so far in the inquiry. This spreadsheet has been shown to a number of witnesses so far, but the inquiry has available to it footage from the pub at the roundabout,
Okay.
White Heather or Gallagher's, CCTV footage from there, some mobile telephone footage, dash cam footage, also recordings of 999 calls and airwaves. I should say we have the airwave transmissions between the police and their control room, not between your control room and the
Right,
paramedics. But effectively what we have done with some expert help is align all of that material according to a real-time clock.
Okay.
And in this spreadsheet, you will see a record of what is heard over airwave and what is seen on the different pieces of footage, and the timings are in the left-hand margin. So I wonder then if we can look at the entries around 7:33. And if I can direct your attention to page 13, please. You'll see in the left-hand column a time 7:33:35 to 7:33:46,
Okay.
an 11-second section. And just to the right-hand side of the midpoint of the page, there's a description of what is seen in the footage from the Gallagher's public house. And the entry reads, the large marked police van pulls forward slightly to approach the roundabout and stops. An ambulance arrives on Hayfield Road approaching the roundabout and stops next to the large marked police van and near the group of people in the pavement area on Hayfield Road. So I'd like us simply to look at that 11-second section
Okay.
of the footage, please, Mr. Rees. That's at 7:33:35. So if we can pause it there just for a moment, I should also explain that we see on the bottom half of the screen the footage from Gallagher's. Above that, we see a bird's eye view reconstruction that shows the placement of certain vehicles and persons. You can ignore the ARLS data in the top right-hand corner for present purposes, and you'll see in the top left-hand corner the real-time clock. Thank you, Mr. Ray.
Put in touch with you.
Check the key from.
If we could pause it there, please. Thank you. Did you see the ambulance
Yes, I did,
arriving? And it can be difficult to watch two things at once, but I don't know whether you saw on the reconstruction tile
Yeah, the ambulance arrived in there, yeah.
a representation of the
Yes.
ambulance arriving too. And is that familiar to you? Is that,
Yes,
that
it
your
is,
ambulance
it
arriving?
is.
Grand. Now, you received the call at 7:24 and you arrived at 7:33, so it took 9 minutes to get from the depot
That's right.
to Hayfield Road. Can you help me with the distance from the depot in Glenrothes to Hayfield Road?
Couldn't really tell you the distance, as in, I'd have to check it up, but yeah, 9 minutes is a normal time and response time from Glenrothes to Kirkcaldy.
And would it have been possible to get there any faster than you did?
No, we're on blue lights, so we're travelling quite fast to that.
So you had blue lights on and sirens?
Yep.
Okay. Were you driving at the speed limit or above the speed
Above
limit?
the speed limit.
Can we return to your inquiry statement, please, and look at paragraph 22? I want to ask you some questions now about the scene that greeted you on your arrival at Hayfield Road. You say at paragraph 22, I thought the patient would be a police officer. I got the impression it was a police officer who was assaulted. Then when it came down as a cardiac arrest, I thought it would be a police officer who was in cardiac arrest. So should we understand that even at the point that you arrived at Hayfield Road, your understanding was that it was a police officer who had been injured rather than a member
Yeah,
of the
that was our impression
the
from the
public?
messages that we got.
And those are the messages on the patient report form that we looked at a few
Yes, that was the
minutes
messages
ago.
coming up in the text on the vehicle tablet.
And was that the sum total of the information that you had
Yes.
at the point that you arrived
That's correct.
at the scene?
Yep.
I'd like to return to the spreadsheet and look at some entries in it with you. And these are entries from the airwaves between the police and their control room. So you won't have seen these entries before,
Okay.
but I'm keen to draw them to your attention and be clear as to whether any of this information was within your knowledge or not. So if we can begin on page 6, please. And if you cast your eye down the column that is second from the left and find the entry at 7:23:34, it's quite near the bottom.
Yep.
It's an airwave transmission by an acting sergeant, Scott Maxwell. Do you see that?
Yes, I do, yes.
From 411, PC Short's been struck to the head, It's a bit upset. I'm going to need an ambulance here to check her over. No bleeding, no visible injury, over. Do you see that entry?
I do, yes.
And that appears to be the first airwave transmission from the police to their control room requesting the attendance of an ambulance, and it relates to a constable rather
Yeah.
than a member of the public. And the timing of that transmission is 7:23:34, and we know that you received a call at 7:24.
Yeah.
If we can move on to page 7. 4 or 5 entries down, there's an entry timed 7:24:28, again from Acting Sergeant Maxwell. Do you see
Yep,
that?
I do that.
Although there's no visible injuries to PC Short, she's been stomped to the body a few times, etc., and struck to the head, and can see if the ambulance can attend ASAP. And then at 7:24:39, the control room says, yeah, we're getting the ambulance now. At 7:25:01, the control room says, units at the locust, can you just confirm what the actual locus is? And at 7:25:06, Acting Sergeant Maxwell says, It's Hayfield Road, junction with Henry Road. So do you see all of that information there? So would it appear to be the case that your ambulance was dispatched, or the call came through, I should say, at 7:24, and that was in relation to the officer who'd been injured at the scene, and that the officers in attendance had confirmed to their control room at 7:25:06 that the locus was Hayfield Road at its junction with Henry Road?
Yeah.
If you cast your eye down another 2 or 3 entries, please, Mr. Taylor, to the one time-stamped 7:25:17, PC Alan Smith, do you see that?
Yes,
Roger, this male now certainly appears to be unconscious, breathing, not responsive. Get an ambulance for him. So this would appear to be the police asking for a second ambulance for a member of the public, a man who we now know to be Shekubayo, who had been restrained by the police. And that's the first entry in this spreadsheet that relates to an ambulance for him. On to page 8, please. Four entries down. 7:26:41 again, Scott Maxwell. Do you see
Yes,
that
I
entry?
see that, yes.
I'm just looking to clarify, has an ambulance been contacted for this accused also? Over. And control respond at 7:26:47. Roger, we've asked for 2 ambulances to Seafield Road.
Yeah.
So 2 ambulances appear to have been requested by the Bilston control room, who presumably contacted South Queensferry.
Yeah.
And we see that an error appears to have crept in there around the address. It's been
Yes,
given as Seafield Road. If we can now move on to page 11, please. Two entries from the top, another transmission by Scott Maxwell at 7:29 and 30.
Yes,
Control, can you get a move on with the ambulance? This accused is now not breathing. CPR is commencing. Over. So do we see now that this is a further update from the police, that Mr. Bayo was no longer simply unresponsive but wasn't breathing? And control respond at 7:29:42. East Overview, I'll give him a call, and at 7:29:45, yes, supervisor here's calling them. So it again appears that some contact or communication is in place between Bilston and South Queensferry. On to page 12. At the very top of the page, 7:31:22, Sergeant Maxwell. Control, any update on ambulance, we could really do with it here. 7:31:27, Control says they've been given a hurry up. And then at 7:31:57, ETA is 3 minutes. And further down the page, 7:32:25, Roger, ETA 2 minutes for the ambulance, and we know that you arrived at 7:33. You said earlier that the sum total of the information that was available to you was what has been recorded in the patient report
That's
form.
correct.
So these transmissions that I've taken you to that were between the police and their control room, was any of that information conveyed to you beyond that you've recorded in the patient
No,
report
there's no
form?
anything, just what was recorded in the PRF.
All right. We can put the spreadsheet to one side for now. I'd like to ask you to describe the scene when you arrived.
It was quite a busy scene, so as we approached, they were actually starting to tape off the road, so they let us through the tape, and then as we were driving through, there was just ambulances, police cars and police vans all around, and there was a lot of police officers in the scene, and then we drove through the scene towards the end of the road.
Let's look at paragraph 20, please, of your statement. And here again you explain that it was a very busy scene and that there were cars and vans there already. And at paragraph 21, I briefly saw the patient lying on the pavement with the police around carrying out CPR or chest compressions. He was handcuffed at the front and with leg restraints.
That's correct, yeah.
And at paragraph 29, you provide a description of the patient. You say the patient was black, looked quite young, he was maybe in his 30s. He was quite muscular, so he looked as though he was fit and trained at a gym. I didn't know who he was at the time, but I now know him to be Sheikh Bayo.
That's correct.
And you explain in the paragraph that follows that him being black had no impact on your assessment or treatment.
Yes.
Can you describe for the chair, please, the demeanour of the police officers when you arrived at the scene?
When we arrived, they were looking quite busy. The area was getting taped off. There were some looked a bit shocked and looked a bit sort of just standing, looked a bit shocked. And then the ones that we focused on was the ones that were doing the CPR on the patient.
When you arrived, did you carry out an assessment of the patient yourself?
I did, yes.
If we can look at paragraphs 35 and 36, please. You say you carried out a primary survey. What's a primary survey?
A primary survey is your ABC. That's the immediate life-threatening issues that you have to address.
So ABC is that airway, breathing,
And circulation. That's right.
Okay. You explain at paragraph 35, I carried out a primary survey. There was no catastrophic bleeding at all. There was no obvious injuries contributing to a cardiac arrest at that point, and his airway was clear. I checked his airway by looking into the airway to see if there's any blockages that may stop the oxygen going into his lungs. I inserted an oropharyngeal airway into his mouth.
That's correct.
What's that?
It's a plastic tube that goes into the mouth and it stops the tongue falling onto the back of the airway.
Why is that important?
It's important because the problem when somebody's in cardiac arrest, the tongue becomes loose and it just automatically falls down to the back of the airway, and it eventually occludes the airway and stops any oxygen getting in.
Paragraph 36, you say, I couldn't detect any breathing. I was looking at the chest rising and listening for breathing. I couldn't by that point detect any pulse at his carotid pulse at his neck, so I requested the police officers to continue with the chest compressions. With no pulse detected, I realised this patient was in cardiac arrest. So your primary survey is that there are no obvious injuries. This gentleman was not breathing. There was no obvious pulse. He appeared to be in cardiac arrest.
That's correct.
Paragraph 38, please. Here you say, I said to Alan just to get the stretcher out because it had started to rain at that particular point, so it was better just to get him out the rain, get him into the back of the vehicle, and we'll try and do everything in the privacy of the ambulance. Why was it better to get him out of the rain?
If you're in a cardiac arrest, you would be using a shock box or defibrillator. And then when you're actually putting the pads on the chest, if you put that on the chest when it's wet, the contact's ineffective. And you also run the risk as well of having the shock going across the chest, having water in the shock. Although the risk is minimal, there's still a risk of us getting a shock.
You said it was raining. Had Mr. Bayo been covered with a blanket or a coat?
No. It did start to rain at that point that we arrived.
So your initial assessment was that he appeared to be in cardiac arrest, and we've heard some medical evidence already that the treatment for a cardiac arrest is CPR.
That's correct.
If we can look at paragraph 39, please, where you explain, I got the bag and masked out, attached the oxygen, started to bag and mask with the police officer continuing chest compressions, and Alan went to get the stretcher from the ambulance. The chest was rising with the bag and mask, and the flow of oxygen was moving. So we've heard that CPR involves a combination of chest compressions and breaths.
That's correct.
So what purpose does the bag and mask serve?
The bag and mask is effectively simulating the breathing. So the bag and mask goes over the face and over the mouth and the nose, creates a seal, and then when you're pressing the bag, it pushes oxygen into the lungs and effectively breathing for the patient.
paragraph 40, you explain the information you got at the scene from the police was that he was restrained, went into apparent cardiac arrest, and then CPR was commenced by the police.
That's correct.
Is that right? There's a more detailed explanation of how the bag and mask work in paragraph 26, if we could look at that very briefly. You explain it's called an ambu-bag. It's a face mask that goes over the nose and mouth with a large bag attached to it. You apply an oxygen bottle through a tube. It gives 100% oxygen into the bag and mask. When you place the mask over the patient's nose and mouth, it creates a seal that allows you to squeeze the bag and push oxygen into the patient's lungs. When the air goes into the lungs, it expands the chest. It basically breathes for the patient. Hopefully the oxygen in the lungs will then transfer over to the bloodstream and get oxygen into the body.
Yeah.
And if we return to paragraph 39, which we looked at a moment ago, you explain in the final sentence that Mr. Bio's chest was rising with the bag and mask, and the flow of oxygen was moving.
Yes.
Does that mean that the simulated breathing appeared to be serving the
It's working well,
purpose?
yes. The air was clear and the oxygen's getting okay and the chest is rising.
Mr. Taylor, did you personally carry out chest compressions at the scene?
No.
Did you witness the police carrying out chest
It was the
compressions?
police officer that was doing chest compressions, yes.
We've heard that Mr. Bio was handcuffed to the front.
That's right.
So far as you could see, did the presence of the handcuffs have any effect on the officer's ability to carry out the chest compressions?
No, it didn't impede on the CPR.
Can we move on to paragraph 43? You explained that your intention was to remove Mr. Bio from the roadway or the pavement into the ambulance, and you go on to explain that once inside the ambulance you connected up the defibrillator by putting 2 large pads on his chest, one on the upper chest and one sort of more to the left side. It allows you to see any rhythm on the screen of what the heart is doing, or allows you to apply a defibrillator shock to that patient. It has to be on bare skin. I can't remember if we cut the t-shirt or if the chest wasn't exposed when we arrived. So what exactly is a defibrillator?
A defibrillator is a shock box that allows a shock to be carried across the heart. It basically stuns the heart and hopefully a rhythm of start, which will then make the heart pump.
And how do you connect a defibrillator? You make reference to connecting
There's
a
2 large
defibrillator.
pads. So one pad would go up here on the right shoulder and one large pad will go onto the left at the side of the chest. And the idea is that the shock will go across the heart.
Now, did the presence of the handcuffs have any effect on your ability to access the chest
No.
and connect the defibrillator?
No, it didn't have any problem.
Can we look at paragraph 44, please? So, am I right to understand that having applied the defibrillator, before you administer a shock, you get some sort of reading?
Yes, we see a reading on the screen, yes.
And do I understand correctly that you would only then go on to shock if you get the right sort of reading?
That's correct. There's 2 rhythms, ventricular tachycardia and ventricular fibrillation. That's the 2 shockable rhythms.
So if the rhythm is other than one of those, then the heart
You can't
isn't
shock it,
shockable?
yeah.
Okay. You say, we saw on the screen that he had an irregular sinus rhythm. That's when I realised there must be some kind of heart rhythm. I was feeling for the pulse and I was able to find a very faint carotid pulse in the neck. So you had explained that there wasn't an apparent pulse and you assumed that Mr. Bio was on cardiac arrest for that reason.
That's correct.
But having connected the defibrillator, has it demonstrated that there was some sort of heart rhythm and therefore there must have been some pulse?
Yes, the cell indicated that there could be a pulse there, so that's what made us check again.
Okay. And does that mean that you wouldn't then proceed to shock the patient because the heart was
The heart's
functioning?
beating, yeah.
The heart was beating.
Yeah.
And you explain at paragraph 45 this meant that he was in respiratory arrest, so we just continued using the bag and mask ventilations in the back of the ambulance. So should we understand that where the patient is in cardiac arrest, they need both the breath as well as the chest compressions, but for respiratory arrest, the appropriate management would simply be the simulated
mask,
breath.
yes, yeah.
So in this case, the bag and mask. And 47, please. Here you simply explain that a cardiac arrest means you're not breathing and your heart has stopped altogether. A respiratory arrest means you're not breathing, but your heart has electrical activity and a faint pulse, meaning your heart is technically beating. You go on to explain they're both as severe as each other. At the end of the day, if you're not breathing, you're going to go into cardiac arrest. Potentially cardiac arrest is the worst scenario. If you're not breathing, it can be corrected if there's a possibility to correct that. And then you go on to explain the treatment for respiratory arrest is the bag and mask. For cardiac arrest, it's the bag and mask and chest compressions. If you have time, you could gain IV access and give cardiac arrest drugs, adrenaline and amiodarone. If a person is in respiratory arrest rather than cardiac arrest, as you had confirmed Mr. Bio was, would there be any need to give drugs of this type?
The most obvious drug you would give for a respiratory arrest would be a drug-related incident where it'll be heroin. If somebody's taking heroin, somebody tends to go into a respiratory arrest, so we could give them naloxone for that.
And in layperson's terms, is naloxone effectively an antidote to
the heroin?
To heroin. Were you provided with any information, or did you see anything that caused you to think that this might have been a heroin overdose?
No.
So was naloxone given?
No.
I think, in fact, you explain at paragraph 53 that you could give someone naloxone if we're talking about heroin or Valium overdose. I didn't believe it was an overdose. There was no evidence of an opiate overdose, so you don't just fire it in for the sake of it. So it's not a drug that you would give prophylactically. There would have to be some evidence of
Yes,
an overdose.
you would get some evidence from the history or the situation that would suggest that something had been taken, but in this particular case, there wasn't.
And the drugs that were mentioned earlier in your statement, amiodarone and adrenaline, do they serve any useful purpose in a respiratory arrest, or would they only be required in the case of a cardiac arrest?
Yeah, they're only used in cardiac arrest.
Have you ever heard of a drug called Flakka? A synthetic cathinone?
No.
If you had been advised at the scene by the officers and attendants that they believed that he had taken a drug called Flakka, synthetic cathinone, would you have considered administering naloxone?
I'm not familiar with the term Flakka. Is that a street term or a street name?
It is. We've yet to hear evidence about its technical properties or more formal names. But if it had been suggested to you that Mr. Bai was under the influence of a drug with the street name Flakka, what would you have done?
I haven't come across that name, Flakka, so if that be the case, we would have to discuss it between ourselves what the drug is. If it was found to be an opiate type drug, we could give him naloxone, but if it's not an opiate type drug, then we couldn't give anything for that.
And would you have had at your disposal the means of making some inquiry as to the properties of this drug?
Possibly, I've just got to think, 7 years ago. We'd probably either contact either control for information, or if somebody's got a internet connected phone, they could check it up and see what it is.
Are those the sorts of things that you might have done if it had been suggested to you
Yes.
that Mr. Bayo appeared to have taken this drug?
Yes.
In the event you didn't consider that you needed to give any drugs, so you didn't need IV access, but if you had required IV access, would the handcuffs have got in the way at all?
Yes, they would have done. And we had the handcuffs removed at that point.
You would have had to have them removed
Yes,
at that point?
Yeah.
You explain in your statement that treatment continued en route to the hospital. It only took 2 minutes to get to the hospital. It's
Yeah.
actually just further along Hayfield
correct,
Road, we've
yeah.
heard. And that bag and mask ventilation continued en route. Can we return to the patient report, please? the following page, please. So this paragraph at the top on the right. It records male who had allegedly brandished a knife at police, was restrained by police, had been possibly struck on the head with a baton. Now, who provided you with that information?
That was when we were in the hospital. We had transferred the patient over to the hospital bed, and the police officer who travelled in the back of the ambulance, he was on his radio. There was a lot of chatter on the radio, and that's when he offered that piece of information as we transferred the patient over.
So that's information that came from an officer,
Yes,
and I understand that an officer had travelled with you in the
In the back of the
ambulance.
ambulance,
Was
yeah.
it the same officer
it gave us that information.
who gave you that information, and you received that information at the hospital?
At the hospital bed.
Okay.
Yeah.
So that's not information that you had when you arrived at the scene,
No,
and it's not information that you were given during the period of time that you were assessing and treating Mr.
No.
Bio at the scene.
just at the hospital. That's when.
The entry continues, male went into apparent cardiac arrest, CPR by police commenced, on arrival male casualty lying on pavement, handcuffed and with leg restraints in apparent cardiac arrest with police officers carrying out CPR. Crew continued basic CPR, patient lifted onto stretcher and into ambulance due to rain and close proximity to hospital. When defib applied, irregular sinus tachyrhythm seen on screen, checked for pulse and casualty found to have a faint carotid pulse. Bag and mask ventilation continued. Police officer and back of ambulance assisted crew. Police officer drove ambulance to Victoria Hospital. Victoria standby requested. Due to short distance to hospital, no attempt made to cannulate en route. Ventilation en route and at hospital arrival and handover. At what point in time did you write this note up?
This is after we've handed the patient over to the hospital staff. And from our point of view, that's our job finished. I would then go back out to the ambulance. Alan was just clearing up the back of the ambulance, restocking the bag, and then I've written the PRF.
Okay, so if we scroll down the page a little bit to the column on the left-hand side, this is information that I think you said you recorded in real time. It's to do with the time that you received the call, the different updates that you received en route, and it concludes with your arrival at the scene.
Yeah.
But the paragraph further up the page, if we could return to that, please, Ms. Drury. This was completed by you retrospectively, and insofar as it contains information such as the reference to the knife and the baton strike, that's because those are not pieces of information that you had at the time.
That's correct, yeah.
And this is information you say that you received when you got to the hospital.
Yes.
So were you advised at any point before the ambulance left Hayfield Road to go to Victoria Hospital that Mr. Bio had been chasing cars with a knife?
No.
That he had ignored the police when they arrived and acted like they weren't there?
No.
That he had been sprayed several times with CS and Pava spray?
No.
That the sprays had had no effect and he'd wiped them off like water?
No.
That he'd been struck to the head with a baton?
No.
That he'd been restrained by a number of officers?
Not by a number of officers. We just heard that he'd been restrained and went to cardiac arrest.
That he'd been restrained in the prone position?
No, well, just restrained.
Just restrained. If the officers at the scene had had the information that I have shared with you, would you have found it helpful to have received that information from them?
Yes, that was just information that would tell us how the event happened, and that would be information that we would give to the hospital.
Would you have expected them to provide you with that information?
It's very hard. It's when you arrive on scene, you want as much information as possible, but it's a very busy scene, and it happens with all jobs. It only just depends on what information is available, what's happening at that particular point, and how much questions you ask, and how much of what you're doing at the time. So
Things like being struck to the head, being sprayed with CS and Pava spray, are those the sorts of pieces of information you might have expected to be
that would have been
asked
useful,
to
yes.
you?
Yeah.
And why would that have been useful?
That's just information as to what may have led up to the event as to cause the cardiac arrest.
Would you have done anything differently if you'd had that information?
No, there'll still be CPR or bag and mask.
Where you're attending a patient who's been sprayed with an incapacitant spray, do you have to take any precautions yourself so that you don't become contaminated with the spray?
I've never actually had to deal with somebody who's been sprayed, but yes, you're very aware that there is spray around. You get contaminated very easily, and it will disable you very quickly. So you have to be very careful how you approach and what you touch.
And the information that I've shared with you now, is that the sort of information you might have thought important to pass to the medical team at the time of the handover?
Yes, it would just, again, it's just more information as to what may have happened or what's led up to that event.
And if control had information about spray and baton strikes before you arrived at the scene, would you have expected that information to be shared with you?
If they have that information, but it's all down to time. It's just how the information is transferred, and in situations like that, there's 9 minutes to get there, so it just depends how much the time between police officers to control to ambulance control, and then to us.
Let's look at the spreadsheet again, please. At page 8. And there's an entry, again it's Acting Sergeant Scott Maxwell. It's an airwave entry at 7:26:52. So that's more than 6 minutes before you arrive at the scene, okay? Just for the log, the initial on attendance, this male's attacked PC Short quite violently. As a result, he was sprayed with CS and PAVA and battened. There may be a suggestion that he's been battened to the head area, 4-1 over. Do you see that?
Yes, sir.
So it appears from this transcript that information, which was acknowledged, you see at 7:27:10, control room, Roger, that information was conveyed by the police to their control room more than 6 minutes before your ambulance arrived at the scene.
Yeah.
But should we understand from your evidence and from what's recorded in the patient report form that in the intervening 6 minutes, that information did not make its way into your hands?
Yes, I didn't get that information.
I'd like to conclude with a few questions about what happened at the hospital. It was a 2-minute journey.
That's right.
And you explain at paragraph 59, please, if we might return to your inquiry statement. That you put a standby at the hospital by radio. We told them we have a standby. You explain this informs A&E that there's an ambulance coming with a patient. We told them what happened and that we were dealing with a respiratory arrest. I presume Alan did the standby because I was with the patient doing the bag and mask.
Yeah.
So you forewarned the hospital that
That's
you have
right.
a patient in respiratory arrest coming in. If we scroll down to the section headed arrival at the hospital, we got to the hospital at 7:44. That's 9 minutes on scene, 2 minutes to hospital, a total of 11 minutes from that scene to hospital. I've read these times from the patient report form. We arrived at the hospital and handed over the patient to the doctors. We opened the back door, took the patient out the back door, and took the patient through the hospital doors into the resuscitation area, resus. This is the area where any patient who's really sick and needs immediate attention and treatment goes. You explain there were lots of hospital staff there, doctors and nurses, all dealing with your patient. At 64, a doctor requested the handcuffs to be removed, and this was done by the police officer who was with us. I can't remember anything about the doctor, but they were in charge. At 65, the doctor asked what happened and if we had any information. I did the handover because I was the attendant in the ambulance. I said the information I had available at the time. He was getting restrained, went into cardiac arrest, and we found out that he's in respiratory arrest. There's a lot of radio chatter on the police officer's radio, and that's when the police officer said that he's possibly been struck on the head with the baton. So this is the handover that you
That's
mentioned
correct, yeah.
earlier. So if you had had information about CS spray or PAVA or FLACA even? Are these the sorts of things that you would have mentioned at
Yes,
this
that's
particular
information we would pass on to the hospital staff.
point in time?
Yeah.
You go on to say once the doctor started dealing with it, we just left and filled out the patient report form in the back of the ambulance. Alan tidied up the vehicle and restocked the equipment. The police officers took our details. From our point of view, that was the job closed. So is it the case then that after you returned to the ambulance, having handed over Mr. Bayo to the hospital staff, that you wrote up your report, restocked your bag, ready for the next emergency?
That's it, yes.
And that was the end of your involvement in this case?
Yes, that was.
Bear with me just a moment, please. I have no further questions for you. Thank you.
Thank you. Any Rule 9, Ms. Connolly? Anybody else? No. Mr. Taylor, I wonder if you would just withdraw to the witness room for a moment while I hear a submission. Yes, Ms. Connolly, if you come to the table, please. Yes.
Thank you, sir. Sir, you heard from Mr. Payton that when he was attending to Mr. Bayo, that he was unable to get the valve, as he said, into the boy's mouth. And he was unable to do so because his teeth were clenched shut. And he attempted to open Mr. Bayo's teeth to insert the one-way valve. I wish to ask this witness, sir, whether when he checked Mr. Bayo's airway, were his teeth clenched? And further, would an unconscious person who was not breathing unclench their teeth?
Is that what
That's the question, my lord.
Very well, I'll allow you to ask that. If
Thank
can
you, my lord.
rearrange the seating. Mr. Taylor, Miss Connolly, who sits at the end of the table here, who represents the Sheku Bayo family, has some questions for you.
Okay.
Mr. Taylor, the chair has heard from a witness who was attending to Mr. Bayo with other police officers, he himself a police officer, at the time that they identified that Mr. Bayo was unconscious and had stopped breathing.
Okay.
This police officer said that he attempted to insert a one-way valve thing into Mr. Bayo's mouth, but his teeth were clenched shut, and he attempted to open the teeth with his fingers, but he was unable to do so. So my question is, when you checked Mr. Bayo's airway, were his teeth clenched shut at that point?
No, for me it was the case I was able to open the mouth and put the airway in.
And would an unconscious person who had clenched their teeth unclench their teeth?
It can do, yes. Sometimes when you're going to cardiac arrest, sort of try and seize up. And then once it goes into cardiac arrest, the body relaxes. So it can happen.
And your evidence is that Mr. Bayo wasn't in cardiac arrest when he was in the ambulance?
When I checked his breathing and pulse on the pavement, I believed he was in cardiac arrest, so I couldn't find the pulse. And then when we took him to the ambulance, that's when we saw the rhythm. And then we reassessed the pulse, and I can feel a faint pulse at that point.
And is that different observation, does that arise from the fact that the machine is more accurate than human touch?
No, it could just mean the fact at the point when he's on the street, the the pulse is that weak that it's not effectively pumping effectively. So the fact that we started bag and mass CPR, we're reoxygenating the body, that could then start the heart or build up the heart. And the time we've got the patient into the back of the ambulance, the heart's now starting to beat.
And in terms of the time that Mr. Bio was on the pavement and CPR was being administered to him, would that have been more effective if there had been air also being put in through the one-way valve?
It's more effective, but then nowadays they're taught when they're doing CPR, we don't do mouth to mouth.
But it would have been more effective in your view?
Chest compressions is what we're taught, the bystanders taught to do chest compressions, and it just then pumps the oxygen around the body. But any oxygen going in would help.
Thank you. Thank you, sir.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Mr. Taylor, for coming to give evidence to the inquiry.
Okay.
You're now free to go.
Okay, thanks.
Ms. Graham, it's now about 5 to 1. What do you propose to do?
The next witness is Brian Geddes.
Yes.
And I don't know whether we wish to start him. We have very little
Yes.
time to get him
Well,
settled.
I think if we stop now and then aim to sit at 5 to 2, that would be the best plan.